All right, so one of the biggest questions that you might have is why? Why do we have to go through all of these regulations in a laboratory? Why do they want to make my life miserable? Why do I have, as an analyst, have to follow all of these rules that my boss wants me to follow? And the answer to all of those questions is because the feds said so. Uh, a lot of times when you get bitten by a dog, you are very hesitant to pet the dog again, right? That one time, that one experience is enough to basically make you second guess everything else that you do around that animal. Well, the animal here was the laboratory, and the feds, like consumers and the FDA and the EPA, were bitten. And once they were bitten, they wanted to step in and make sure that they do not get bitten again. So in the 1970s, and you've read some of these articles already at this point in the module, we had severe cases of malpractice. We actually gave laboratories benefit of the doubt. Leading up to this point, we thought that laboratories would do the correct thing. We thought that the owners of the laboratories would basically make sure their products are safe and effective before they release them to market. And we wanted to double trust and not really even double check these laboratories if they were testing some type of product in their laboratory. We thought that reputations were good. We thought that the people that ran these organizations, many of them had PhDs and they were smart and they were top of their class. But we were bitten. And what we found out and what we discovered is that many labs, not just one, like the BioRad article that you read about and discovered all the horrible things that they did, but what we discovered is that many of these laboratories were providing inaccurate information. They also were providing sloppy information, and they also made up fraudulent data. They made it all up. So these laboratories basically became a hub, and they were getting used. Now, why do I say that? Well, a lot of times what happens is that I have a big company here, and I'm going to put some type of manufacturer. And that manufacturer will make a product. And that product could be anything. Doesn't really matter. But they make a product. And that manufacturer could do some of their own testing. And they could have their own laboratory. But very often, they wanted to outsource that product to an independent laboratory. And this laboratory was someone that had no affiliation with the manufacturing side at all. So, for instance, maybe this is not what happens, but this will give you an example. Let's say that I have a company called Bayer, and Bayer, as an employee, makes aspirin, and I form it into a tablet. Well, I'm going to send that tablet out to an independent laboratory that is not employed and that does not get its payroll from Bayer. And that laboratory will take the aspirin and they will test it for various parameters. And they will send the report back to the manufacturing facility. And they would say, well, this is what we found, or this is what we didn't find, or you gave us these as regulations. So this is basically out of spec, out of specification. And you need to go back and maybe you need to rework the tablet. No one's going to want to tell this multi-million-dollar company that they're going to have to stop their production and go back and rework the tablet. So these laboratories were basically getting used. And the laboratory needs to make money. And they know that the more of this type of testing that can come their way, the more money that they would get, and the more money means bigger lab, more employees, bigger bonuses, bigger paychecks, and they maybe would squib a little bit. If the data fell out of specification, maybe they would lie and fudge on the number. Maybe they would get a little sloppy in the testing and they put things passing when they should have failed. And maybe they just didn't do the test at all. Maybe they just wrote numbers down on a sheet of paper and they sent it back to the manufacturing company. Sometimes the manufacturing facility and the laboratory facility knew that this type of agreement existed. They were aware that the manufacturing companies were dumping tests on them and that the laboratories were providing inaccurate data. Sometimes the manufacturing companies were completely unaware, but they were blamed because it was their product. The laboratories finally started to get sued. But in the beginning, it falls on the back of the manufacturing facility. It falls on the back of the parent company and not the laboratory until some kind of awareness or some kind of proof is made, as in the case of the Biorad lab. All right? So this was all a public safety issue. I mean, we're talking about corruption. This was corruption basically in the laboratory world when all of this was basically brought into the limelight and people became more and more aware of it. The problem here is that the article that I had you read concerned IBT, and IBT stood for Industrial Bio Test Laboratories. And IBT was one of the first ones to basically gain attention and traction as far as let's take a closer look at this relationship. Let's take a closer look at how the manufacturing facility and the laboratory itself is related to each other. All right. So one of the first things that you read basically in the Biorad article was some horrendous stories, right? And this is just kind of a quote that comes out of that article. And it says, quote, during the course of a 2-year feeding study involving more than 200 animals, the mortality rate in the swamp, and if you've read the article, you know what the swamp is, reached 80%. Okay, 8 out of 10 rats decided to die because of the laboratory care in the laboratory facility. Dead rats and mice decomposed so rapidly in the swamp that their bodies oozed through the wire caged bottoms, and they laid in purple puddles on the dropping trays. Could you imagine being basically a government organization putting all the trust in these laboratories and that these laboratories are doing the right thing and they're following through procedure and they're reporting reliable results, and this is the scientific community that we're talking about, and then to realize that this particular lab was so nasty and so disgusting and the employees did not care how the laboratory was ran. They were just there for a paycheck. To read a story and to see pictures of rats being so old and decrepit and nasty that they were oozing through the bottom of the animal cages in a purple gunk, it blew people's minds. And this is the reason that IBT came on the map the very first time. And that's the reason that the GLPs maybe started to gain traction and say, we're going to have to step in. We're going to have to actually go in and maybe give these laboratories some rules to follow on a daily routine. And we're going to have to check to make sure that they're doing it. Another quote Because of the perfunctory nature of the observations, tissue masses come and go, and animals die more than once. In fact, some rats listed as dead later were recorded as alive, and then dead, and then resurrected once or twice more. What is going on with IBT? Well, if you look, inaccurate data, sloppy data, and fraudulent data. What IBT was doing is basically having a series of rats. Those rats have to be trained, they have to be tested, they have to be tracked. And according to the data and according to the findings, this laboratory would actually note that some of the rats would die, and then later on say that those same rats were basically still alive and they were still doing testing on them. That's fraudulent data to its core. But IBT was doing it because they needed money. And the people that were basically going to IBT knew that they would probably provide them inaccurate, sloppy, and fraudulent data just to pass their product. So that way the manufacturing company could go and give them these laboratory tests and say, listen, we had our product tested by a lab, and here's the results, and everything is okay. This drug is safe to take. And here's the data to prove it. All the while, the data was fraud. Okay? All right, so a little bit maybe of organization that you might not know existed unless you currently work in a laboratory now, but this is what we would call the test facility. So IBT was basically a test facility for other companies. And these sponsors basically go to the test facilities and they say, here's our product, and we would like for you to test our product doing this method, or this is what we want to know about the product that we've just made, or the product that we want to release to the public. And the test facility would do those tests, and then they would give those tests back to the sponsors. The sponsors, once they received the actual reports, would then turn around and they would submit all of that data to the EPA and the FDA. And the EPA and FDA would look over all of the data that was submitted on that particular product. The FDA and EPA trusted the laboratory data because they wanted to trust the test facilities. Notice this is kind of out here. The test facilities had nothing to do with the FDA and EPA. The test facility only provided the data. That was it. It was up to the sponsors to go to the FDA and EPA to get their product approved. Well, the FDA and EPA reviewed the data. They took a look at the laboratory directions, maybe the SOPs, the final results that came through, and they probably approved it or they declined it. And if they approved it, then the FDA and EPA gave the sponsor permission to release the product. If they said no, then the FDA and EPA told the sponsor, no, we're not going to release it, and this is why. And then it goes back to the drawing board. The sponsor would then probably hook up with the test facility again, do more tests, do additional tests, provide more information than what they did before, and then the FDA and EPA could review that application again. But notice there's no direction between the EPA, FDA, and the test facility before the GLPs were put in place, right? This was during the time of BioRad. This was during the time where laboratories were basically making up false data. They had no oversight, and no one was coming to them like the federal government agencies to make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And that was the problem. That was the loophole that was getting experienced by some of these companies and some of these test facilities that allowed products to escape into the market and into the public place. And that's scary. So this is the reason that GLPs were basically put into place. These companies knew, these regulatory bodies knew, that a underlying problem was double checking these test facilities. And they had to come up with a way in order to make sure that these people were legit, that these people were no longer making up data and killing rats in purple puddles of goop in their facility. So here comes GLP. So you can blame these nasty laboratories back in the day for all of the problems that we have to go through now. All right, so in the next video, we'll pick up from here and we'll talk about maybe some ways that the FDA wanted to fix it and some implementations that both FDA and EPA put into place.